Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Diego Kanzik. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Northwestern University, and I would like to very warmly welcome Charles Taylor today, who will present his work, Homeward Bound: How Migrants Seek Out Familiar Climates. Charles is an assistant professor at Harvard Kennedy School. He does very exciting work on environmental economics with a focus on climate, agriculture, land use, ecosystem services, and migration. What stands out to me about his work is the creative use of new data sources such as satellite data and remote sensing products, as well as a very strong policy focus. Some of his work has already been published in leading journals, such as the American Economic Review or the Journal of Financial Economics. So we are very excited to have you today, Charles. But before I give the floor to Charles, I would like to invite the audience to take part in a short survey. So there are two questions here. I just read them briefly for you. If you live, work somewhere different than where you were born, how important to you was the destination's climate in that moving decision? And there are 5 options to answer: not at all, slightly, moderate, very, or extremely. And the second question is, in general, do you think people are happier or more productive if they live in a climate they are used to? And again, 4 options here: not at all, slightly, moderate, or very. So I give you a bit of time to answer. Okay, so on the first question, it seems that it actually matters, the destination's climate. At least for 44%, it matters very much, and for another 33%, at least moderately. And on the second question, also seems that people are happier and more productive. So I think this sets the stage perfectly for the topic of today's talk. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Charles. You have about 50 minutes, and to the audience, please feel free to write questions in the chat as we go along. And at the end of the presentation, we will have time to discuss these points. All right, thanks so much, Charles.
Great. Thank you, Diego. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And judging by that poll, perhaps my research isn't that surprising. And I mean, this is a lot of people's priors that this is an important thing that determines outcomes. So hopefully, maybe I'm just kind of going to reassure you of your priors are correct here. But today I'm going to present joint work with Margarita Bolensky of Columbia. She's a PhD candidate, and then Marco Tabellini at HBS. Okay, so here's a map of the US. Take a decade 1920 at the county level, and it shows the primary ethnic group for each county among people who are European. So, for example, the color in light green are kind of counties that historically had the most Germans. The orange is Russian, and you can see in this distribution of a number of different countries in Europe have kind of different spatial configurations throughout the US. And there's some clear clustering going on, right? This isn't entirely random where different groups end up going. So what this paper tries to do at a very high level is, what explains maps like this? What explains some of this clustering? There's long been this hypothesis, that's been proffered. This is by Calvin Coolidge, a former president of the US, that said, the newcomers from Europe commonly sought climatic conditions in the US like those in which they were raised. right? So this intuition, exactly as you had in the poll, that people were trying on some extent to sort on climate. And if we look at a comparison between Europe and the US, right, you can empirically kind of look at some of the correlations that we saw on that map, right? So this is a map of just averaging over an entire year for each location, what's the average temperature in Celsius, right? So blue is colder, red is hotter. The white areas are about 10 degrees Celsius on average. And as you can see, let's take the Scandinavians, for example, in the green circle, right? There seems to be some implicit matching of where they are in Norway and Sweden, and then the climate that they ended up disproportionately in Minnesota and in the northern Midwest of the United States. And that was the end of Coolidge's quote, right? That Scandinavians are chiefly found here. This paper was also motivated from some personal history here, where my grandparents were farmers and homesteaders in the northern U.S. And my late grandfather liked to joke that the Norwegians chose Minnesota for its mild winters. It was like his favorite joke. As I've been interested in this idea for a while, and I was lucky enough to spend last year as a postdoc in Berkeley, California, which, as you know, has very pleasant weather. And I was talking to a gardener, and I'd see this plant all around. This is a succulent called the Pride of Madeira. And what was remarkable as I learned about it, this plant was from a small island chain called the Azores, the Portuguese island chain in the Atlantic Ocean. And these succulent plants from the Azores were all over the Bay Area in California, right? And also there's a disproportionately large Azorean people population in the Bay Area as well. So this, not only was there some, and incidentally, these also had very similar climates of this very kind of unique coastal ecoregion that both areas are. So not only was there a movement of migrants to this similar climate, but also a movement of plants reflecting the kind of climactic similarity. Another example looking outside of Europe is the settlement of Vietnamese people in the US after the Vietnam War. And one of the large centers of Vietnamese population is in southern Louisiana, which, as you may know, is the relatively hottest and most humid part of the U.S., where there's a large fishing industry led by the Vietnamese that kind of approximates some of the fishing practices that you'd get in the Mekong Delta, for example. So there's sorting on this dimension as well. And I'm not going to go into all of these, but I've kind of collected a number of these anecdotes additionally. Basques in Idaho, where it's similar to the Pyrenees Mountains, Greeks, Poles. I'll note the Ukrainians in eastern Washington in the wheat farms of the Palouse, similar soils and climate to Ukraine. And there's just a number of ones that you kind of anecdotally keep hearing as you travel the US and talk to people. So what I want to do in this paper is formally test this folk wisdom, right? So do migrants select destinations based on climate? And, do people from cold places go to cold places, hot places go to hot places? And why is this important? Well, we know kind of in general, climate change is an increasingly important driver of migration. A number of the literature is increasingly showing that. And there's also this kind of other strand of literature that says, overall, people have a preference for mild climates, right? There's kind of this amenity idea of that, like, people, all things equal, try to avoid extreme cold and extreme hot. But no one has really looked at relative climate, right? They kind of assume that this preference holds across the board and that any change in climate from this kind of, 20 degrees Celsius or 65 degrees Fahrenheit, I don't know if I did that conversion correctly, but, is bad. And that might not be the case if you take into account the relative climate change based on what someone is used to. And why might this have important welfare implications? Well, first, let's think about the mechanisms here. And this is what I'm going to talk a little bit out of the paper is this idea of, like, climate, first of all, can just be an amenity, right? It can be something we like. Right, it can facilitate cultural practices. It's It's how the hobbies that we do. Think of kind of everything that is kind of in your what you like to do and how closely tied it is to the climate that you are from. But there's also this big aspect of climate specific skills and climate specific human capital, right? So think about it specifically from a farming standpoint. I'm a farmer. If I'm used to farming in a cold location, I have no idea how it works in tropical agriculture. Food will spoil. I don't know the seed stock. I don't know the plant types. And likewise, someone who has learned farming in a hot area wouldn't know how to deal with freezes, how to keep their livestock alive in the winter, et cetera. So these are almost like based on climate, these are very different occupational skills that you could have that could, by how much you match, could affect your productivity from a labor standpoint as well. So we're going to, once we kind of establish this, we're going to then try to explore some of the economic implications of this finding, right? We're going to try to back out the value of climate similarity. So kind of how much is someone willing to pay to keep their climate fixed or to deviate by, say, 1 degree Celsius. And then we're also going to think a little bit about using some projections under climate change, how this might shape future migration patterns. And kind of by an extension, right? I think this might also pose an interesting opportunity to think of migration as a laboratory for climate change, right? Every single person who migrant, probably everyone on this call is migrated at some point to grad school, to a new country, to anything, right? You're going from one climate regime to another, right? So if we can kind of use that as a test case to understand what some of the medium to long-term effects of climate change are, could just potentially be another approach to think about estimating climate damages. So I'm going to study this in depth. I'm going to focus on the US, and I'm going to use a bunch of data sets. I'm going to use link samples, full count census, death records. This is going to be internal migration in the US. So if I move from Massachusetts to Berkeley, California, but it's also going to be international migration to the US as well. We're going to look at both the historical time period, 1850s onward, as well as the modern time period to make sure that this isn't just kind of a historical anomaly and understand the persistence of this over time. And why the US? Well, first, as you might have seen in that map of the average temperature, there's a large amount of climate variability. If you one prominent way that we measure climate types is this thing called the Köppen zone. And the US has more Köppen zones than any other country, even if you're just including the continental US, with China and India second and third. So given just the geography of the country, but also the geographic forms, the mountains, the lakes, the Gulf of Mexico create kind of all these different climates that one can choose from, right? So, and then complemented with that, there's been relatively few restrictions on movement, which is unique for most countries historically, right? So there's a huge caveat here among restrictions among Black Americans that have been formalized informally and formally in the law, as well as Native Americans and different ethnic groups, the Chinese Exclusion Act over time, which are notable and important. But overall, especially in the context of other comparisons and in the recent era, there's relatively free movement where one can kind of move to decide within the US, where would I move to best match my climate if they take that into account. And then also these kind of rich data sets that we can use.
Charles, can I just jump in here real quick? Because I mean, it's a point about external validity. I think this is an excellent setting to basically figure out these migration patterns in a world that has relatively few restrictions. But if you think about future patterns of climate change around the globe, there would likely be more restrictions in place, right? Say if I want to move from Africa to Europe, that's not that an easy task. So how do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely. So the external validity might be less because the US is such an anomaly in this regard. But we can still use this as a laboratory to think of the costs of mismatch, right? So let's then say, right, like we see what happens if you aren't able to match, or how much you're willing to pay to match. And then if there are these restrictions in other contexts, right, with, we can see whether those would extend where people aren't able to match as well as they could in a counterfactual situation with more openness. So that's a good point. Okay. So let's just kind of jump into some of the descriptive evidence here. So this takes a decade in the US, 1880, and every foreign-born person in the census. And what we're plotting here on the x-axis is the average temperature over the course of a year of the capital city in the country where someone's from. And then on the y-axis is the average temperature of where they settled in the US. As you see, there's this relatively clear upward pattern and the upward correlation that we see with a lot of the coldest countries in our data set. This is kind of Scandinavia, the Baltic states, also settled in the coldest parts of the US, right? And then kind of as you go a little bit further, kind of more into continental Europe, where it's getting a little bit more mild, you move up, and then you have some Southern Europe, and then kind of on the right-hand side, you have a number of countries outside of Europe, which had relatively small populations in the US at this time period. But we see the same pattern if we just look at mortality records, which also have country of birth in around 1960, where we'd have more of a representation of countries from hotter baseline climates as well, where we see this pattern holding. So just in the correlation, when we see this, when we plot the scatter plot, there does appear to be some evidence of sorting. But then what's interesting, we can even zoom in on one point. This takes Norway down here, a relatively cold country that settled in a relatively cold part of the US. And through a linked census, we can know where people came from within Norway and then where they settled within the US. So this is looking at within country variation. Not only did people from Norway go to colder places, but did people from colder parts of Norway move to colder parts of the US? And we again see this kind of suggestive correlation here, which is remarkable as well. But as you notice, Norway has a relatively small, the distribution of Norwegian immigrants is relatively small and concentrated in the northern part of the US. So we wanted to apply this to what is the largest historical ethnic group in the US, or at least historically of German, people of German extraction, and see if this holds. And here we matched using World War I death records and names, and did a name matching by geography algorithm to estimate where people in Germany were from with similar last names in different parts of the US, and then plot this correlation. And we find a similar pattern in Germany, which has more overall climate variability, as well as their distribution in the US has more climate variability. And we see again this suggestive thing that people from colder parts of Germany, Hamburg, are settling in colder parts of the US and vice versa. So with that suggestive evidence in mind, we wanted to put a little more formal structure around this and test this model using a gravity model, using both international migration as well as internal migration. We're going to use the Norwegian setting again, and this is for two reasons. There are historical full count censuses that we're able to link over time. So in this case, we're going to link the Norwegian census of 1865 to the US census of 1880 to try to find people, Norwegians who actually migrated to the US and track them over time. And while a relatively small proportion of the population in the US, a large fraction of Norwegians migrated. About 15% of the population did in the late 1800s. And so what the intuitive metric that we're going to use here is what's the climate distance from Norway to the US? So this shows throughout the US how far the distance is in absolute terms from Oslo, for example. And we'll have the detailed administrative birthplaces like other than Oslo, but this is just kind of to give you some intuition of what we're measuring. Where the areas that are more white have a more similar climate, and the areas that are more blue have a less similar climate. So what we're going to kind of formally test is this measure of distance in degrees Celsius. How does that predict migration flows under a gravity model? And so we're going to use this linked census, and we're going to collapse all this at the Norwegian municipality level and the US county level, right? So this is every single Norwegian municipality to US county is a pair that's included in this regression. We're going to use a PPML, a Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood model here to deal with the fact that a lot of flows between counties have zeros or very few flows of migrants, which is common in the migration and trade literature. And what we're going to model is flows between each pair, origin, O, and destination, based on the distance in the climate. And we're going to use an absolute value difference, as you saw in this chart here, between an origin municipality in Norway and a destination county in the US. We're going to include, just simply for now, precipitation and temperature averaged over the entire year. We can do a lot more different climate metrics. You can think of summer season high, winter low. You can think of seasonality things. General results hold. We're just trying to use the most parsimonious one to start. We're going to use a number of kind of geographic fixed effects, and we'll jump to the results here. So what this table shows is it's modeling the number of migrant flows based on the temperature distance between each of these geographic pairs. So what this is saying, this negative coefficient that we see here is implying the more there's a temperature distance, i.e., I'm diverging more from my origin temperature, the less migration flows that are happening. And likewise, we see a negative coefficient consistently with precipitation distance, meaning that the more apart two sets of locations are in terms of precipitation, the less migration flows there are. We can include a number of these different controls. The first model, we're not really controlling for anything. We're just looking at the correlation. We can control for a county's distance to New York City, which was the main port in which Norwegians came during this time period. We can control for state fixed effects in the US and Norwegian province fixed effects to kind of get at, even within Minnesota, for example, do we see some evidence of sorting by migration? And then we can also include much more granular sets of controls as well. And it doesn't budge our estimate all that much in terms of the impact that this climate distance has. We can also look at we can plot the same coefficient of temperature over different time periods of sample linkages. We might think just maybe it was something about 1865 to 1880 that was spurious, or something about the distribution of migrants, right? Well, we can link it in different time periods between different Norwegian censuses and different US censuses, and we find a generally negative effect of more temperature distance and less migration flows. You can also see on this chart, there's a gray coefficient being plotted with standard error bars which are at the 95% level. That is also this concern that kind of in the migration literature, Card et al., that it might just be reflecting past migration flows. There was an immigrant enclave in Minnesota that might have matched on climate, but then everyone followed those people rather than on each successive time matching on climate. And we find that we do lots of ways to test this, and we don't find that kind of historical migration flows or ethnic enclaves are what explain this dynamic. So if we jump really briefly now into a US internal migration context, where we established that climate similarity between where I'm coming to as an international migrant in a Norwegian context and where I'm going in the US is an important factor in determining migration flows. We're now going to look at this context in the US. What's nice here is we have a very long-term data set of US censuses that we can link over time. So we use the full period from 1850 to 1940. They're descending every 10 years, there's a census in the US. And this is a period coinciding with the westward expansion of the US. Here again, I want to be sensitive to the fact that this was not empty land. There were Native Americans settled here, and there was when I say kind of a westward expansion, this is of a largely European population displacing a Native population. I do want to be sensitive to that. But here's what the population, the known population density of the US looked like in 1850, right? Primarily on the East Coast and in the Northeast. And then you can kind of see this gradual expansion over time. 1910, 1940, and the population of the West Coast. And so it's this movement over time. I'm going to try to understand how much climate similarities determined why someone from a given county here decided to move to a given county here. So what does this our climate metric look like in this context? Well, I just picked kind of a random point. Let's say you're a person right here where this red dot is in the Delta region of the US, right? We can compute the climate distance in all directions from that point. So white areas are closer and have more similar climates on average, but also Southern California has a similar climate. Mild parts of Eastern Washington State have a similar climate. So what we're going to do is compute how much we're going to redo our same regression, but using this kind of domestic-based climate distance as our measure. So we're going to use we're going to have this panel of all these different time periods. So we're going to have migration flows across each decade. But now instead of Norwegian municipality to US county, we're just going to do county pairs in the US. And again, we're going to use the PPML. And we're going to be modeling the migrant flows between each county origin and county destination in a given decade T. But in addition to climate distance, we're also going to be controlling for physical distance. And I'll talk a bit about the kind of spatial correlation of climate a bit, which is one of the things we take very seriously. But what this looks like is quite similar to our Norwegian story, where here again, we're modeling out the migrant flows based on the distance between any two county pair in terms of temperature and precipitation. And what we see is, again, this kind of consistently negative coefficient, and for both temperature and distance and precipitation distance. It holds after controlling for physical distance, as well as a whole suite of fixed effects and economic and geographic covariates. Let's think about the magnitudes a little bit. I've provided these tables, but what do they mean in terms of how material is this impact? So there's a relatively large effect. So the mean movement in our sample here is the average person moves 5.3 degrees Celsius. Right, so you're going from one climate to another, and that movement of the mean level of temperature would equate to an increase in migration flows of about 1.4%. So if there's two counties that are about 5 degrees Celsius more connected, you would expect about 1.4% more migration between those areas. And to put that into context, Boston to DC, for example, is about 3.6, so a little bit under that. So this is a move greater than that. And in terms of the trade-off between physical distance, which people are also minimizing, this movement is equivalent to about 1,000 kilometers in physical movement, which is about New York City to Detroit. We see a magnitude effect of kind of thinking about it again in distance, where people are the mean precipitation distance in our sample is about 30 millimeters a month, and people are willing to trade off about 200 kilometers of physical distance for that. The effects are larger in the US context, but similar in overall magnitude to the Norwegian context. And we kind of consistently see this pattern of temperature being a little more important in terms of the size of climate, in terms of climate matching than precipitation, which is kind of interestingly also similar to what we see in the climate change literature in terms of that is estimated the damages of climate change on agriculture, on labor productivity, generally finds that temperature explains more of the variation in these outcomes than shocks in precipitation. If we look at this by decade, kind of see a similar story. There's some attenuation of the effect over time, but still quite persistent throughout the census time period. And also if we include lagged migration flows or different ways for controlling for immigrant enclaves or prior migration, we don't see that budging our estimates all that much. But as I alluded to, there are some very real spatial correlation concerns, right? So you might have heard of the first law of geography. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things, right? So the nice thing about the international context that we did, the Norwegians to the US, is we don't have to worry about that because the Atlantic Ocean kind of operates as this big reset. It's this big thing where all of a sudden, once you get to the US, right, the relative distance that you might move is swamped by like how far of a distance you had to get to get to port. But in the US example, that's not quite as relevant. If moves on average are short and places nearby have mechanically correlated climates, then we might see some kind of mechanical result here, even with kind of our best efforts of controls. So we can quantify this kind of using, if you're familiar with a variogram or just kind of a basic regression, right? Where just how much of temperature distance variation is explained by geographic distance. We find that geographic distance does explain some, 22% of this variation in temperature, but there's still kind of this residual 80-some% that isn't. So to take this very seriously, we do this we try to address this in a number of ways. We control for geographic distance non-linearly. We allow for moves to be separately for each direction, from north to south, from east to west, etc. We can control for latitude and longitude distances. So you can kind of think of these as like gradients in which temperature precipitation might be correlated. We can just drop neighboring counties or states altogether to say, like, we're only going to look at longer distance moves, where in theory the climate correlation breaks, et cetera, et cetera. And we find that our results are very robust, suggesting that it's not the geographic proximity that's determining this. And finally, I mean, this isn't an econ history audience. I don't think there are many econ historians in the room, but another concern is about sample bias and who actually gets linked in these senses, right? That there might be some groups that are systematically excluded that might have kind of that might drive some bias in our results. And the nice thing is, in the 1940 census, they ask people where they were 5 years before, and this doesn't require linking across time periods. And we see a similar set of results in a much later time period and a different, without requiring any assumptions about linking. I won't go into this all now, but I'd say the kind of takeaway here is that this relationship's just extraordinarily robust, right? Like, climate is being taken into account in movements in almost all contexts, in almost all ways, and in any type of robustness test that we can do it, and the effect is quite strong and persistent. I guess one or two to like quickly highlight is, one concern is, like, climate is correlated with a number of things that are geographic, right? So similar climates might have similar soils. So we can control separately for soil distance based on attributes like pH, siltiness, clay content. Climate might be related to the terrain, right? Mountainous parts might have similar climates, and you might just like mountains. You know, we can control for terrain and elevation. We can also control for coastal proximity, and we find kind of a similar result. Another one is what other factors might have shaped the population of movement over time. We can think about railroads, market access, frontier exposure, controlling for all these measures that are used in the economic history literature. We see this effect persist. So hopefully I've convinced you, just in at a given period of time, climate is really important to determining migration flows. But you still just might be concerned that there's just some omitted variable bias here, or that there's something else that might just by randomness kind of explain why this happened, and it's not an active updating of people's beliefs. So here we're going to look at long-run changes in climate. So this is going to say, okay, let's just look at two places over time, and over the last 100 years or so, did they converge in climate or did they diverge? And did that convergence predict the change in migration flows during that time period. So if you're familiar with like a long difference approach, it's kind of conceptually similar, but we're going to do this in a stacked panel. And you might say, oh, climate change, is a more recent phenomena. Well, there's a lot of multi-decadal, what we call oceanic oscillations that have always been happening that can cause spatially distinct changes in climate, right? So in the 1930s, there was warming in certain regions of the US and the world and cooling in others, more precipitation in others. And kind of this creates a bunch of spatial variation that we can use to test this hypothesis, even kind of before 1980, when we really start to see human-based warming occurring on the record. We're going to utilize both that as well as this naturally occurring spatial variation to estimate this. So our model is the exact same as what you saw before, except for now we're going to include 2 periods of climate and 2 periods of migration in this stacked panel. So what does this look like? What does this variation look like? Well, again, I'm going to take this little point in the Delta region of the US. And green areas, we see a convergence to that county's climate. So they got similar over this 100-so time period. And red areas, we see a divergence. So we're going to see, do we see a concurrently, a similar change in migration patterns based on this spatial pattern of this change in climate, which is, relatively small. It's a degree or so divergence according to the scale over this time period. And kind of, as you can see here, we're modeling the same thing, migration flows on temperature distance, and we see this kind of, again, consistently negative coefficient for both temperature and precipitation. Precipitation a bit weaker, but of a relatively similar magnitude to what we found in our panel. So this is suggestive that it's regardless of initial sorting, right? Like people are responding on some level to observe changes in climate over a much longer time period, and migration patterns are moving accordingly. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about why is this? Why would this persistent fact both be happening kind of in the cross section as well as kind of in these long-term changes in climate over time? So there's 2 potential channels here that we propose. One is climate-specific human capital or skills. You can kind of think about this most obviously in the context of farming, right? What crops do you know how to grow? Do you know how to deal with pests, right? Bugs and funguses. Food preservation, right? If you can't keep your food good over the winter or the summer, right, you're not going to survive. But there are also other elements where like climate-specific skills are really important. Think about house construction. How a house is built in a tropical area to deal with heat and airflow is very different than how it's built in a cold climate. Just anecdotally, I'm in Massachusetts right now and lived in New York before, but probably the coldest winter of my life was a winter in Berkeley, California. And that was largely because the houses were so uninsulated, right? So that the housing construction mattered a lot in terms of this. And you can imagine, especially historically, that this would be quite important as well, where you had more kind of local knowledge in terms of these things. But also immunity and familiarity with viruses and disease vectors, right? That knowledge can obviously have an effect on your human capital as well. And then the other channel relates to amenities, right? So we can think of cultural practices. Do you like to ski? Do you like to sit outside? Do you like to garden? What do you do for holidays? How do you interact with your community? Right? A lot of these can be tied to climate, as well as hobbies and food preferences. So kind of, I guess I don't have to convince any of you, and I mean, based on the polls early on, that this is something that people take into account. My co-author is Italian, and he still complains about the winters in Cambridge, even though he's been here well over a decade. But the other thing I want to point out is this isn't necessarily, these aren't mutually exclusive. Then they likely complement each other. So the kind of the scenario, again, I'll pick on my Italian co-author, is let's say you love pizza and you love this particular tomato that's grown in a part of Italy. And so both the whole farming infrastructure and history of that place would have grown around that agricultural system to grow those certain crops. And then the food preservation and cooking techniques would have grown out of that climate to then process, store, and cook these things. And then so would have your preferences, right? They would have been tied to the climate available foods that were there, and thus your amenities and your enjoyment of it would be tied to it. So it's very hard to untangle, but we're going to try to do this a little bit. So first way we do this is by looking at heterogeneity across occupation. So we take our subsample using census data and just say, look, let's separately estimate this based on whether you're a farmer or other characteristics. And if climate-specific human capital is important, we would expect that occupations that are climate's more important to whether you live or die, people would show a bigger preference. So this is plotting the coefficient, and lo and behold, what you see is that the effects are largest and that farmers are trying to avoid moving climates the most, and workers in the service industry the least, but still are also sorting on climate, right? The coefficient is still strongly negative. Another way we can think about this dimension is what was the change over time of this coefficient, right? So in the backdrop of all this, we've had air conditioning, we've had much more office workers, a much smaller fraction of the population works in agriculture, right? So you would imagine those forces kind of allow us to adapt to different climates than we had before. So this attenuation of the effect over time is also kind of aligns with this idea that this preference might become less strong over time. But notably, and we also then put this red coefficient here where we plot this exact same effect using our same model, but using recent IRS county-to-county migration flow tables, that it's quite similar to what we saw in 1940. So people still today, in the era of the service economy and air conditioning in the US, are still sorting on climate, which implies that there is probably this big amenity channel that's also happening given the relatively low exposure that people have in terms of their work on average to climate these days. So with this in mind, how can we think about using this setting beyond just it being kind of a curious historical and current day fact to estimate the value of climate? Well, we're going to now turn to a historical policy called the Homestead Act. This, again, kind of a paper of, I love this paper for lots of reasons, but another is a personal reason here. This is a patent where the Homestead Act granted a bunch of land in the US to settlers. And this is my great-grandmother, Tora Tufte, a Norwegian who got a patent for 160 acres, 320 acres of land in Montana in what era was that? In I think 1917. And where this was, it was a very hard piece of land. I don't know if for those who are folks familiar with U.S. geography, this is a very cold and dry place in the U.S. And to be an independent woman homesteader doing this was a very difficult time. So it's kind of a curiosity of mine, like, why did she end up there, right? Like, did climate matching kind of explain, and the relative price of land that was given, the subsidy of land under this program, explain why she perhaps went to such an extreme climate? So what this act did was it provided 160 acres of land pretty much for free to farmers. So if you homesteaded it, you had to pay in total about $345 in current dollars to procure the land. And there were some title fees and some other fees that you had to do, versus the kind of market alternative was buying it from the government directly, kind of one time. And that was an order of magnitude more expensive to get the same type of land. And largely the same lands were available either under the Homestead Act through this process, or you could just there was a process of buying federal land. 10% of US land was transferred. So this was arguably the largest transfer of land in US history and I think global history. And it went to about 1.6 million farmers. again, want to state that this land often was lived on and occupied by Native Americans and displaced them. So I want to be sensitive to that. But under this, it kind of provides this nice setting to estimate the marginal value of climate, right? So if we know kind of from all this other results that I showed you that migrants are minimizing climate distance where they can, but then this Homestead Act essentially gives a bunch of near free land, which diverts migration towards these counties, we can kind of intuitively think of the size of this diversion and equate that to the change in the price, like how much cheaper land was under this, to kind of get at what the trade-off is for each individual, including my great-grandmother. So we collect the universe of land patents filed since 1862. We compute the county share homesteaded over this 1860 to 1920. And what does this look like, for example, right? This is a good chunk of the US, right? So this is one decade, 1880, the share of lands in these counties that were homesteaded, right? And you can get well above 30% of lands in these areas. And it's not just the northern Midwest, which you might have heard of the context, right? A lot of the Central Valley of California was settled this way, as well as parts of the South and Florida. So we're going to run our exact same gravity model, but now we're going to include an interaction based on whether a county in a given decade hit a certain homestead threshold. And here we want to just see whether this affected people's decision to match on climate or not, right? And if we just focus here on temperature, right? So again, this first coefficient of just overall temperature distance is negative during this time period, right? So people are trying to minimize climate distance and it's reducing the amount of migration. But this is offset in a county that's offering homesteaded land, meaning that people are no longer penalizing climate distance as much, right? They're taking that less into account because there's this additional incentive of cheap land. So we can compute this difference by thinking about the observed rollout of the Homestead Act and what would have prevailed in the absence of the Homestead Act in a counterfactual. And we can compare the prices between the homestead land and the government purchases, and then calculate, and kind of long story short, you can look at the paper kind of specifically how we do it, but we're able to then calculate a willingness to pay for 1 degree Celsius of about $4,500. So what this means is the average person, settler in this area, needed to get compensated $4,500 to move 1 degree Celsius out of further from the climate that they knew. Okay, in the spirit of time, I mean, quickly going now into this other approach, we'd say, okay, maybe, that's interesting. This was a historical policy in the 1800s, which involved kind of this massive allocation of land. Like, how externally valid is that, and how relevant is it today? Well, let's think of this in a completely different setting. Now I'm going to use more recent mortality data, right? So I'm going to estimate the relationship between the age of death and the extent to which a migrant mismatches their climate. We have this data from 1959, 1961, which tracks the country of birth for all people who died in the US. Right? And why might there be this a hypothesize a mismatch? Well, first, there might be an economic channel, lower earnings, right? Like if this climate-specific human capital takes into account and you match less well, you make less money, you have worse health outcomes, right? And you might die earlier. Another one might just be like direct mortality effect, right? If you're from a hot climate, you might have never driven in the snow, right? That's kind of one small example, but you can think of a number of things where you just didn't, certain risks that you're exposed to, particularly in winter or summer, that particularly if you're elderly, right, could cause mortality. And then you could also think this might be a channel through which shows the amenity value of climate, right? If you are just have less happiness and more social isolation, that could contribute to premature mortality as well. So we can model this. This is individual level now. So this is not a gravity equation. This is simple OLS of like all foreign-born people who died, all 700,000 who died during these 3 years. And how much does the temperature distance between where they were from and where they ended up explain the age at which they died? So we can control for lots of fixed effects. So you might just be worried that they ended up in a place with higher mortality, or that they're from a country or a cohort of migrants who had other disadvantages and might have died earlier. Control for death year fixed effects. You can control for demographic characteristics, whether they're married, how many kids they had, whatever kind of information we have. We see this kind of consistent story of reduced age of death, i.e. earlier deaths associated with each degree Celsius change, distance, and temperature. So we can also look at this not just in absolute value, but see what about divergence from perfect matching, which is 0 degrees Celsius. What happens if someone goes to a place that's hotter? Do they die earlier? The answer is yes, as well as some suggestive evidence if they go to a place that's colder that they also die less. So this is a curve that we often see in the climate mortality literature of either extreme can cause mortality, but this is looking at it from a relative standpoint. So what do we do with this coefficient? Well, one kind of very admittedly crude and back of the envelope thing that we can do is we can attribute it to a value in terms of the premature death. So we can take the temperature distance coefficient from the most stringent specification. So that's the 0.12. That's this right here, right? So this is saying 1 degree C of temperature distance, right, being 1 degree further away from what you're used to, reduces your life expectancy by 0.12 years, right? 0.12 is about 1 month of life. We can take the EPA's value of a statistical life, about $10 million in today's dollars, divide it by the average age of people who died in our sample, which is 73 during this time period, and then multiply this by 0.12, right? And this would come out that 1 degree Celsius of climate similarity is about $15,000 per person. So just one caveat here, right? Based on what we saw in the Homestead Act, right? These people are having to get paid to move further, right? So they're getting some sort of compensation. So this one is not. This is kind of a total cost. This is not a marginal cost like the Homestead Act is, but it kind of gives you an idea of the range of this potential climate distance impact. So to kind of close a little bit on some of the implications here, what can we do with this? Well, we have projections of climate change into the future that are spatially resolved, right? So if climate similarity, and we saw over that long distance approach, even changes over time predict migration flows, we can look at projections of how different places will warm relative to each other, and then estimate how migration flows might change accordingly. Right. So what this is intuitively doing is, again, taking our county in the Delta, right? There's a number of places that are projected to get closer in climate to it, right, are going to converge, and a number of places in orange or red that are going to diverge relatively. So no, these are all similar. These areas right around it are all similar. It's just relative convergence and divergence based on climate projections going forward under RCP 4.5, for example, going to 2100. And you can weight that with population linkages and almost get like a market access type measure, if you're familiar with that literature, to say like what places, what connectivity pathways are going to open up or close to different locations based on this elasticity that we estimated, as well as projected changes in climate, and then we can aggregate that up. We also do that.
That's very exciting. But I think we want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So could you
Sure.
maybe briefly conclude, and then we can move to the Q&A?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Good. I mean, so I don't think I have much here other than to just say, kind of rehashing the results. And right, I think this if this is this big thing that has an important welfare effect, right, we should take this into account when we're thinking about refugee resettlement, as well as our spatial models of climate change impacts, right? If climate distance might be another moving cost that needs to be taken into account when we think about overall climate costs, and then also think about this as a little laboratory of climate change. So thank you for bearing with me here, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. So if you have any questions, I believe you can raise your hand and Soumya can unmute you. Maybe to break the ice a little bit, I will start with one question. And one thing I was wondering, I mean, I completely buy the mechanism. You have done a lot of robustness, but I was wondering, when we try to predict migration flows, have you done kind of a horse race, basically looking at different predictors? I mean, I know you control for physical distance, but I could also imagine that economic factors could play a role, right, in the destination that I'm going to pick. So have you tried to do that? And how important is climate compared to some of these other potential predictors?
No, we haven't, but like being able to answer, I think that's a great comment. Being able to answer the fact of like how important is climate distance relative to these other well-known factors that drive migration. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
Great. I think you have been extremely clear, so I don't see any hands, but I can go on with another question, maybe because I found this last result that you have on basically the effects on, or Michael, do you have another question if you want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to figure out how to raise my hands, couldn't figure it out. So really quickly, I was trying to pick this up and maybe you've already explained it. I guess I'm thinking about as these costs, you measure these costs, and I'm thinking about as the climate scenarios start to play out, you get this sort of acceleration of climate change. And so the dislocation between sort of location and climate and industry, some of these economic mechanisms or things that you're talking about could become larger and larger. I guess I'm wondering if you're viewing these estimates now as potentially like a lower bound, which is sort of in my head what I would think about, because as it accelerates, it seems like the movement will have to change and sort of the economic or these mechanisms, these factors that you find could become further apart. Or how do you view that going forward? I'm trying to sort of tease this out as I was looking through this last part of the presentation.
That's a good question. I mean, I mean, right, all of these, like if any of these kind of connectivity zones are correlated with, other economic linkages there, and those get get disrupted with climate change, those could be additive there. I'd have to think about that one a little bit more. I think that this is one, in terms of like, is this a lower bound overall, right? We're not really able to, I mean, right, just mortality, for example, isn't going to take into account a lot of the other kind of amenity type values or welfare ones that wouldn't necessarily, like your own happiness or well-being, that like wouldn't result in you dying earlier, but just like your discontentment that a lot of the people in this, in the poll showed if you had a big climate distance. So I think in terms of if you're able to kind of calculate the overall welfare effect based on like the some of the non-economic factors as well, like this might be a lower bound from that end.
Thanks.
Great. Yeah, the question I wanted to ask before we maybe wrap up was about these last results on basically the life or the age when you die. There you basically hinted at that. I mean, there are different channels that could drive these results. Some of them are maybe more economic channels, others maybe more cultural channels. So is there any evidence that you could try to disentangle these, or basically that's hard because of data limitations?
For future work, we're trying to get like much better linked census to mortality records where we'd have more covariates, where it's like, again, right, it'd be suggestive if we saw the effect was bigger among certain occupations than not, we could think about mechanisms. Or if looking at cause of death, right, is the cause of death from violence, right, versus accidents versus cardiac arrest and so I think there's a lot to that in future work we'd love to do to understand that mechanism better of like why, yeah, like it's like why someone would be dying earlier, but that's a good suggestion.
Great. All right, I think we're also out of time. So thanks so much, Charles, for a very engaging presentation. And also thanks to all the attendees for joining. Now, I mean, it's in a very exciting time for looking at climate and climate-related topics with the COP going into overtime. So thanks for bearing with us, and we will continue with the webinar series next year. So stay tuned. We will post future presentations on our website and social media. And in the meantime, we wish you a very happy holiday season. All right. Thanks again, Charles.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
Take
Diego.
care of you all. Bye-bye.